So we've made it to the last video of this lesson. And in this video, I'll be talking about the social instinct. Now, the social instinct comes up with some completely different dynamics than the self-preservation or the sexual instinct, as you will see. The social instinct is all about our social embeddedness. It's all about finding our place in the group and in society. Now, that doesn't mean that people who are social dominant are better at finding their place in society or better in terms of social embeddedness. No, but it just means that for those people, this is just more important. They care more about it. They can see, they consider this their way for finding survival. So this is what is keeping them more awake than maybe the other instincts. So the social instinct is very much about our relational intelligence, this whole idea that in order for me to be okay, you also need to be okay. So it's really our understanding of how we bond as a tool for survival. So actually, whereas the self-preservation and the sexual instinct are very much focused on the I, the social instinct is more about the we. And this also explains that when social dominant people speak about sex, they tend to speak less about their personal experiences or their personal preferences. They tend to talk more about sex as a societal phenomenon. And the other thing with social dominant people is that they tend to be slightly less jealous than others. Now, on the other side, on the more negative side, these people tend to be so committed to the group that sometimes they don't have enough time and energy left for the erotic domain with their own partner. Now, it's very important to understand that for the social instinct, sex is not about the physiological or about the emotional gratification. Sex is a tool for bonding. It's a social activity. It's a way for interacting with other people. So it's not about the sexual act itself. It's not about this energetic intensity, but it's more about relationships. So you could think, so what does this have to do with sex? And me, initially, I also thought that maybe the social instinct doesn't have a big role in sex, but actually it does. And it took some time to understand that. But before we go into more detail, maybe we should look at how sex can actually contribute to this kind of social cohesion. Now, in our contemporary industrialized society, the state creates a social safety net. If you end up without a job, if you fall sick, if you become a widow and you have kids, the state is going to provide you with your living. The state is going to give you money to support you. But this is actually a rather new invention in human civilization. If we're going back a few thousand years, basically the social safety or the social security system was composed of our family. It was the people with whom we have a blood connection and the people with whom we have sex. And even if we look at the early 20th century Hawaii, people there were actually saying that sex is a glue for society, because they actually understood that people who have sex with each other also take care of each other. And if we actually look at the functions of sex, one is basically the taking care of each other. People who have a healthy sexual relationship with somebody else are normally inclined to take care of the other. And that actually increases our chances of survival, and it actually helps in reducing inequalities in society. And if we go back even further in history, if we go back a few million years and we actually look at our closest family member, if we look at the primates, the bonobo, it's one of the big apes. We actually share more than 99% of our DNA with this bonobo, and we had a common ancestor about 4 million years ago. If we're looking at behavior and social structures, there's lots of commonalities, but the most interesting thing in the social behavior of the bonobo is that they are using sex as a tool for social cohesion. They use it as a tool for lowering potential conflicts. They use sex as a way of solving fights. and it's really the basis for creating a stable society. So it would actually be interesting, how would Homo sapiens have looked if we wouldn't have all this sexual repression? Now, before we go into more detail, I think it's very important to look at the misconception that some people may have about the sexual and the social instinct. Many people believe that the sexual instinct is about one-to-one relationships and that the social instinct is about being part of a bigger group. Now, this is partially true, but it's actually not very accurate. And understanding the real dynamics is maybe a little bit more complicated, but let's try. I mean, the social instinct is very much about relating. Now, relating requires two individual entities that are engaging with one another. So the social instinct, people who have a strong social instinct, they still fully experience their own individuality. But they are just trying to adapt to each other. They are catering to each other's needs. They're reciprocating and they try to communicate. So here the awareness of the other is very important. So it's not about big social groups. I mean, the social instinct can also be about the interactions we have just in a group of two people. Now, the sexual instinct is actually not about this relating. It's not about maintaining our primary relationship. It's not about reciprocity, actually. The sexual instinct is all about being attracted to somebody. It's the desire to have, it's this desire to consume the other. It's this desire to conquer and become one with this object of desire. It's this urge to merge. It's this desire to transcend reality. So whereas the social instinct requires this kind of separateness, the sexual instinct is all about overcoming the separateness through merging. So it's not about two individuals relating to one another or being aware of one another, but more about this energy that's between them, more about transcending this individuality. So actually, the sexual instinct is maybe less aware of the other, but more idealizing the other. So we could actually say that both the social and the sexual instinct are looking for a connection, but they have a completely different interpretation of what this word connection means. For the sexual instinct, connection is about an emotional state. For the social instinct, connection is not some kind of emotional thing, but it's just a tool for survival. Now, if we go to Ross Hudson's zones, then we see the first zone in the social instinct is the interpreting zone. And this is all about reading people, noticing their moods, being sensitive to one another, reading between the lines, attunement, so tuning in to the others and being interested in them. The interpreting zone is also about empathy, concern, adaptation, and so on. So, in sexual terms, this zone is responsible for our awareness of the sexual needs and desires of our partner. So instead of focusing on our own pleasure, it's having a genuine interest in the needs and the desires of the other person. This zone is about catering to the needs of our partner. And this can even include providing sex to the partner even if we are not interested in sex at the moment. But it's really catering to their needs. The second zone is the connecting zone. And that is very much about creating and maintaining relationships, communication, play, reciprocity, and so on. Now, I already spoke about this before, but during sex, and especially during orgasm, oxytocin is released. And this oxytocin actually is called the love hormone, and it's responsible for some kind of emotional bonding. It wants us to take care of our sexual partner. So basically, whereas everybody has this release of oxytocin during sex, for people with a strong social instinct, the effect is maybe even stronger. And so actually for people with a strong social instinct, sexual partners have some kind of special place in their heart or in their mental map of friends and acquaintances. So it seems that for people with a strong social instinct, they create a very solid emotional bond with somebody they had sex with, even if this is with somebody that there was a one night stand with, and that was already 30 years ago. And quite often, such a sexual partner, even after 30 years, can still count on this kind of unconditional sympathy and support from this social dominant person, because the vulnerability that has taken place in this sexual interaction has created some kind of unlimited confidence. So if you would say there's some kind of hierarchy of friendships, then people with whom there has been a sexual encounter still have some kind of different place than just an ordinary friend with whom they did not have sex. Of course, this is only the case if the sexual encounter took place with mutual consent and full respect. I mean, if there was dishonesty or abuse, then of course the situation is going to look completely different. Now, a second important aspect of the connecting zone is about reciprocity and give and take dynamics. Now, many people may not agree with it directly, but people who are self-preservation or sexual dominant are actually more interested in their own experience. It's more about what they can get out of it. It's more about their own pleasure. But of course, because of our romanticized views of sex and love, we don't allow to admit this. And on top of that, I mean, everybody has social instinct in them. I mean, even if the social instinct is your repressed or your blind instinct, it is still going to be present. So there's still going to be an element of mutuality, regardless of the strength of the social instinct. Now, the social instinct, as I said, is about give and take, and it's about this desire that we are both happy. And so basically we understand that we may have, I mean, our partner may have wishes that we don't share, but we're willing to find a compromise. So if our partner wants to have sex, I mean, if the partner desires it and I don't want it, and I'm still going to engage sexually because I understand that this is important for my partner. Maybe two more issues that I want to say with regard to this connecting zone. Communication, and then second is exhibition. Now, communication is crucial for the social instinct because it's very much about how we engage with the other person, right? So I'm not going to go into detail here because there's an entire lesson dedicated to this specific aspect. But the second thing that I wanted to mention is with regards to exhibitionism. And it seems that there's a clear link with the social instinct here. And it seems that most people with exhibitionist tendencies have a dominant social instinct, and the secondary instinct is going to be the sexual one. Because this exhibitionism is somehow their way of connecting with other people. I mean, they try to show themselves, so they show up in society. That's a social aspect. But they do so by tapping into their sexual instinct. So, of course, that's not going to be everybody, but there's actually some types that are maybe more prone to show off their body and clothes under the pretext of loving their body. So, for example, there's the example of a social 7 I know who posed nude for a journal. But she basically said that she was paying tribute to the beauty of the naked body and that she was still young and she wanted to show this body. But subconsciously, she was actually just seeking some kind of attention and admiration from a wider community. Now, the third zone is the participation zone. And that is all about involvement, belonging, caring for the other, and caring or contributing to the group. So here, identity and being part of the group are very important. And also in this context, we're talking very much about the importance of norms, values, standards, and of course the enforcement of all these rules. So the first thing that I want to say about this participation zone is how being part of a society always includes questions of power, hierarchy, domination, and submission. So the social instinct is playing a very big role in BDSM. I'll say more about BDSM. There's a specific lesson dedicated to that, but I want to make a few points quickly already. Now, the power plays of domination and submission, it's all about how do we relate to one another. It's about how do we find and respect each other in a small group of people. It's about how do we communicate, how do we create consent and agreement. And because in BDSM it's important that there is a permanent feedback of how does the other person feel and are we still okay with this. So BDSM is actually all about relating. It's all about some kind of hierarchical relationships, because quite often there's actually no sex involved. There is often no penetration involved in BDSM. It's all about this agreeing and exploring boundaries together. And also in BDSM, what happens very often that it is about status and some kind of hierarchical relationships. Because if we're looking, for example, at the master and slave dynamics or the sugar daddy and the daughter dynamics, and very often there is no intercourse whatsoever. And actually, we don't know how long BDSM has really existed, but maybe this is something very specific to our contemporary society. I mean, this is just one of the thoughts that I have made, because if we're looking in nature, we'll find hierarchies everywhere. But in our modern day democratic society, we value equality and egalitarianism. And basically we want to get rid of all these hierarchies. But deep inside our natural inborn wisdom, we still have this search for some kind of hierarchies. So basically, I believe that by creating power dynamics in sexual play, people are somehow trying to overcompensate for this demonization of hierarchies. It's basically their way of going back to interpersonal relationships where there is always somebody who is having power over somebody else. Now, the second interesting element about the participating zone relates to the possibility of distributing our attention to more than one person. People who are self-preservation or sexual dominant have this focus on one person, but people with a social instinct are actually able to somehow distribute their attention to two or more people. They can really have 2-3 meaningful relationships, and they're able to navigate them very well. So this is actually why, if somebody is in a polyamorous relationship and they're successfully handling all of this, most likely this is going to be a person with a strong or a dominant social instinct. But we'll go in more detail in the module on non-monogamy here. But what I can tell you now already is that people with a strong social instinct tend to be less possessive, and this is why they are able to share their attention with multiple sexual partners. So for example, threesomes or group sex or poly relationships. And also here there's less fixation basically on the primary relationship as a way for survival. I mean, these people have more of an inherent confidence that they're going to find their survival somehow in the community and not on the primary partner. Now, of course, this does not mean that everybody who has a social dominant instinct is going to be polyamorous, or that they're going to be drawn to consensual non-monogamy. Of course, the key thing here is going to be, well, what are the values? What are the sexual values of this person? So for example, in a religious community, you're not going to find much of this non-monogamy. So I would say the social instinct is not going to predict if somebody is going to be non-monogamous or not. No, the social instinct is more going to hint at the likelihood of a person being able to cope with the complexity of this non-monogamy. I mean, imagine that there's some kind of triangular relationship. Imagine there is one guy with two women. I mean, these are three relationships that need to be handled. I mean, if you find it difficult already to handle one relationship between one guy and one woman, then what about one guy and the woman, the guy and the other woman, and then these two women? They're also in some kind of relationship, and this all has to go harmoniously. So you really need a very strong social instinct to be able to handle this. And the third issue that I want to mention about this zone is about new types of relationship structures, and here the Bay Area in the US is somehow dominating all this experimenting, because there's some kind of focus on social and hierarchical relationships that are based on sexual relationships. So for example, if you look in the Bay Area, you can find a very rich vocabulary that is about sex used to determine identity and social belonging. So for example, rope family, hierarchical polyfidelity, or closed group swinging, or a polytribe, or a polycule, or an emotionally monogamous heart swap swinger. I mean, these are all these terms that you may hear, and they actually don't have that much. It's not about sex. It's all about what is your identity, how do you identify. So you can also find quite often that people may be polyamorous but actually not sexual. So again, this shows that it's all about the status in the group and not about the sexual relationship. It's not about the sexual act. It's more about this negotiation and the permanent renegotiation of the agreements and the rules of engagement. Building further on this, we get to the fourth element of the participating zone, and that's about sex as a marker of identity. Now, sexual identity can be used by some people to create in-groups and out-groups, basically to decide who is part of the us and who's part of the them. Now, these identity markers that we can hear is something, just to give a few examples. I mean, somebody can say, I'm a cisgender bisexual monogamish male. That's really about identity and not that much about sex again. Or the other thing is these gender pronouns that are very much in fashion in the US, when people refer to this he, him, his. I mean, it's all about a self-identification. It's all about how do we see ourselves in the collective. But it also leads to the creation of groups. So for example, there's very tight-knit communities of LGBT, about BDSM, swingers and so on, and they have all their own forms of social dynamics with their own symbols that they may adhere to. Because if you think about it, not everybody who's homosexual is part of the gay community. I mean, not all of them really are so driven to attend gay parades or waving the rainbow flag. For some people, it's just a matter of their sex life. For other people, it's part of their identity. And if it is part of their identity, that's very often because it is the social instinct that somehow acts on this situation. Now, this then logically brings us to the next point, which is on values. And values and rules are very much a societal phenomenon that are constructed by religion and public administration. And this very much applies to sex and sexuality as well. If we're looking at the monotheist religions, they're all trying to regulate sex. They all try to look at how sex should be part of society. And actually, if you look at religions, they're all obsessed about sex. I mean, for example, if you abstain from bodily pleasures, then you have more chances to get to heaven, according to Christianity. Or Muslim martyrs, they can expect to have the company of 72 virgins when they get to heaven. Or 2 of the 10 commandments are actually dedicated to adultery. But not only religion, but also secular state administrations are really looking at enforcing some kind of roles on sex. So they have legal codes, they decide what is allowed, how transgressions are going to be dealt with, how people are going to be punished. But there is also the social rules where, for example, rulers were allowed to have more than one wife and the commoners could only have one. So this already shows also a bit the link between sex and status is very much from the social domain. And even if we look now in some countries, especially Muslim ones, there are some places where the richer men or the men that are higher up the hierarchy are allowed to have more than one wife if they can afford it. Now, as I said, I mean, the participating zone is also about these values and rules that need to be adhered to. And actually, rules are indeed needed for a society to thrive. I mean, without these norms, a society is not going to function. But one part of enforcing the rules is actually through naming, shaming, and blaming. I mean, these are very important tools to ensure that people adhere to the societal rules and they're not crossing any red lines. But this naming, shaming, and blaming is something really from the social instinct. So if we are looking at statements like, oh, polyamory is bad and immoral, or that girl is a slut because she slept with so many guys, or, well, you see this guy, he's a loser, he can't even find a woman. Or stupid monogamists are just repressed and they're not open-minded. I mean, this is all about the social instinct. You can hear it from different sides, right? I mean, some of the values may be sexually liberal, other statements may be sexually repressed, but it's always the social instinct that comes up and has some kind of judgment. Because if we are looking at people who are social blind, they tend to care less about the sexual behavior of other people. They're not going to spend their name judging the sex life of other people. So what is also interesting with social dominant people is that quite often they get some kind of sense of superiority out of their sexual values. And it doesn't matter if they are sexually liberal or sexually repressed. So if they find that their open-mindedness about sex is somehow superior, or if there's strong negative views on homosexuality, for example. I mean, both sides think that they are somehow superior, and none is superior. I mean, these values are just human creations. There's sex has no value. I mean, there is no moral value that is inherent to sex. Moral values are all created by people.